Imagine a child is born with a strange birthmark. Nothing necessarily unusual about that. Plenty of people are born with birthmarks. But then that child gets a little older and starts talking. And they tell their parents that that mark isn't random. They say, "This mark is where I was killed." They begin describing another house, another town, another mother, another father. Sometimes they even describe a husband or wife. And they talk about these people like they aren't imaginary. They talk about them like they really miss them. And then someone investigates it and they find the town, the family, and sometimes they even find a real person who lived the life that the child had been describing. Now, is this just a coincidence? Information they overheard? False memories? Or could this really be reincarnation? Tonight, we're looking at children who supposedly remember living a life before. And some of these aren't just stories posted online. For decades, researchers have actually traveled all over the place, interviewing these children, their families, witnesses, and in some cases comparing what the children said with medical records, official records, and details surrounding the death of the person they claim to have been. Researchers associated with the University of Virginia have investigated more than 2,500 cases like this. And there's another pattern. The children usually start talking about these memories when they're extremely young, usually somewhere between the ages of 2 and 5 years old. And then, as they get older, these memories often begin disappearing at a rapid rate. And what makes this even stranger is that some of these children were supposedly born carrying birthmarks that were in the same exact place as the person they had been describing was injured. So maybe there's a perfectly normal explanation for all of this. Maybe we're really just looking at a coincidence. Stories that may have changed over time. Children absorbing information without anyone realizing it. And we absolutely need to consider those possibilities. But after looking into these cases, I'll tell you right now, some of them are a lot harder for me to dismiss than I originally expected. And you have to think, if these children didn't live a life before, how do they remember dying? We'll investigate that and more in tonight's episode of The X-Files. What if unexplained fears are just memories of how you died before? What if imaginary friends aren't imaginary, but people the child remembers from their previous life? Or what if some recurring dreams that you've been having that feel real aren't dreams at all, but you reliving a moment from your previous life all over again? Now, before we get into individual cases, there's something important you need to know. Because when you hear the word reincarnation, you might picture ghost stories, physics, or somebody claiming they were Cleopatra in another lifetime. Now that's cool and all, but that's not really what we're looking at tonight. One of the biggest names in this field was psychiatrist Dr. Ian Stevenson. He spent decades investigating children who spontaneously claimed to remember previous lives. And spontaneous is important. These weren't supposed to be people undergoing hypnosis and then being asked what they remember. These were usually very young children who simply started talking. Stevenson and other researchers looked for things that could actually be checked and verified, like names, places, people, events, behavior, and physical characteristics such as unusual birthmarks or defects. Stevenson's work in this area eventually became known worldwide. In 1997, he published Reincarnation and Biology, a two-volume work containing more than 2,000 pages, including 225 cases involving birthmarks or birth defects. Now, does that mean Stevenson proved reincarnation is real? No. And even researchers studying these cases would not tell you every single story is equally as strong. But here's why I find this interesting. If we're dealing with nothing but made up stories, why do the same basic pattern keep appearing in all these stories? Like, a child starts talking around the ages of 2, 3, or 4 years old. They describe another life. They sometimes become extremely emotional about it. They occasionally recognize people connected to that life. And then, as they get older, the memories usually begin to disappear at a rapid rate. And then they don't remember them at all. They don't even remember talking about them. There are even people who wonder whether a newborn crying could somehow be connected to leaving whatever came before. Think about that. What if babies crying were crying because they were sad that their previous life had ended and they realized they were going into a new life? Now, that's kind of a stretch, sure, but makes you think, what if? And obviously there's no evidence proving that to be true. But when you start reading these stories, it definitely makes you think about the what ifs. So let's start with possibly the strangest physical part of this research, the marks. Among Stevenson's cases were children born with physical abnormalities that supposedly matched what happened to the person they claimed to have remembered. One case involved a child who remembered being a teacher. The teacher had been killed after being shot from behind. The child reportedly had two unusual marks on its head, one smaller and rounder towards the back, and another larger mark towards the front. Researchers compared those with descriptions of the teacher's injuries, and the locations reported to correspond and match exactly with each other. That's strange, but that isn't the only one. Stevenson's published cases also included a child born with severely malformed fingers who reportedly remembered someone whose fingers had been lost. Another child with missing portions of fingers who described the life of a boy who had lost his fingers in an accident. And a girl with unusual scar like marks running around her head who reportedly remembered the life of someone who had undergone surgery on the skull. Now, a birthmark by itself proves absolutely nothing. If I have a mark on my arm, I could probably find someone in history who was injured in roughly the same location. That doesn't mean I was that person. But that's not really the interesting part. The interesting cases are the ones where the physical features appear alongside memories, names, places, recognitions, behavior. And all those things seem to point towards one particular deceased person. And remember, we're usually talking about very young children, between the ages of 2 and 5 years old. And that brings us to probably the most famous American case of all time. James Leininger. James Leininger was an American boy. He was around the age of 2 years old. And around the age of 2, he started having terrifying nightmares. According to his parents, James would thrash around in his sleep and scream at the top of his lungs. He appeared to be acting as if he was trapped inside an airplane that was going down. According to his parents, he would scream things like, "Airplane crash, plane on fire, God help me, please don't let me die like this." Now, obviously, a 2-year-old having a nightmare isn't evidence of reincarnation. Kids have nightmares all the time. And James already had an interest in airplanes. So if that's all we had, I probably wouldn't even be talking to you about this case. But according to his parents, James started saying things while he was awake too. He apparently talked about flying from a boat, and his parents corrected him. James, planes don't fly from boats. And according to the account, James corrected them. Aircraft carrier, silly. He reportedly told them it was an aircraft carrier. And eventually, he gave them a name, Natoma. His father, Bruce, didn't know what Natoma meant. So he went online and searched for it. And he found something. There really had been an American escort carrier during World War II called USS Natoma Bay. Okay, this is where I had the same question you're probably having right now. How do we actually know James said Natoma before his parents discovered the ship? Because if all we have is his parents telling us this years later, that's a problem. They could remember things incorrectly, they could unintentionally add detail, or if you want to be extremely skeptical, they could simply be making this whole thing up. So, what documentation actually exists? Well, there is a paper trail. After James supposedly said the word Natoma, his father searched for it online. He found information about the USS Natoma Bay and printed it. And that printout still exists till this day. More importantly, the document contains a computer generated printing date, August 27th, 2000. And at that point, little James was only 28 months old. Now, I want to be precise about what that proves. The piece of paper doesn't contain a recording of 2-year-old James saying Natoma. It proves that his father was researching Natoma Bay in August of 2000. And that matters because the family hadn't identified James Huston yet. Now, remember that name, James Huston, because that's going to become important here in a little bit. So, we have the evidence that Natoma Bay part of this story existed and is documented with a date on it before anyone knew which deceased pilot James might supposedly be remembering. But there's more. Before James Huston had been identified, James' parents were interviewed for television with ABC News. Now, the segment never aired, and normally that could sound like another trust me, the evidence existed situation, but researcher Dr. Jim Tucker eventually obtained and reviewed the unaired interview. And that is important because the interview was recorded before the family had identified James Huston. So Tucker could compare what the parents were saying before they knew the Huston story and compare it with what they said afterwards. According to Tucker's investigation, the interview documented several statements and behaviors attributed to James before Huston had been identified. And that's much stronger than someone simply saying they remember a conversation years later. Because now, part of the story has been frozen in time. They can't go backwards and change what they told cameras. So, what did little James actually say? According to the investigation, James said the aircraft had been shot down by the Japanese. He associated his experience with Iwo Jima. He talked about the aircraft crashing into the water, and then he supplied another piece of information, a name, Jack Larson. James's parents didn't initially know who Jack Larson was, but when they began investigating the Natoma Bay, they discovered something. There really was a pilot named Jack Larson associated with the ship. And eventually, all of these clues began pointing toward another pilot. And his name was James Huston Jr. Hudson served aboard the Natoma Bay, and during operations near Iwo Jima, his aircraft went down. Researchers later examined military records, and Tucker reports that an aircraft action report from that day that Hudson died still exists. The report includes a chart showing routes taken by the pilots. And guess whose aircraft appears besides Hudson's on that chart? Jack Larson. So now we're not relying on reincarnation researchers simply telling us Jack Larson existed. There are military records connecting these people to the operation. And Hudson was reportedly the only Natoma Bay pilot lost during the Iwo Jima operation. And James's parents became convinced at that point that James Huston was the person their son had been describing. Now, this was probably my biggest question because James's parents eventually became convinced that their son was remembering a previous life. And once somebody believes something's real, confirmation bias can become very real. You start noticing things that fit and maybe ignoring things that don't. So, did the parents document everything James supposedly said before identifying Hudson? No. I think that's extremely important to tell you. Not everything was documented. James' mother says she took notes about things that James said, but according to Tucker, those original notes were eventually lost or discarded after James's parents had wrote their book. So there are additional things the parents say James knew that we cannot independently prove he said before Hudson was identified. I'm not going to present those things as if they're equal to the dated evidence. They're not. But here's what makes the case difficult for me to dismiss. We don't need every later claim. We still have evidence showing that major pieces of the story existed before Hudson was identified. I mean, let's look at them. Natoma Bay, that was documented before the identification of James Hudson. Plane shot down by Japanese, reported before identification. Crash into the water, reported before identification. Iwo Jima, reported before identification. Jack Larson, reported before identification. And then a real pilot was discovered whose final mission apparently fit much of that description. There's another part of the story, the drawings. James loved drawing airplanes, and some of his childhood drawings still exist. He drew battle scenes, aircraft, and planes going down. But James did something unusual when signing some of them. Instead of simply writing James, he reportedly signed several drawings James III. Now, there are two ways you can look at this. Obvious explanation, he was 3 years old. Fair enough. And that's exactly what I thought. But his parents later told Tucker that James continued signing James III even after turning 4 years old. And they said James explained that he meant he was the third James. And here's the weird coincidence. The pilot was named James Huston Jr. His father was named James Huston Sr. And then this little boy, also named James, was calling himself James III. Now, I want to be careful with this one. I don't consider this proof of anything. James Leininger being named James is something that we have to treat as a coincidence. His parents named him before any of this happened, so there was no way of them knowing any of this. And James 3 could simply mean, I'm James, I'm 3. There is obviously absolutely a normal explanation available. So I'm not putting this one in the same category as the military records or the dated Natoma Bay material. Interesting, yes. Proof, no. But I'd be lying if I said it wasn't some pretty strange coincidence. So how strong is the James Leininger case? Here's where I personally land on James. We do not have a doctor's file containing every statement he made at 2 years old. We do not have recordings of every conversation. And some details his parents later attributed to James weren't documented until after Hudson had already been identified. So if somebody tells you every single thing James ever said was recorded before his parents did any research, that's not true. But the opposite side isn't true either. This isn't simply two parents appearing 20 plus years later saying, trust us, our kids said all this. There is a paper trail with evidence to support it. Jim Tucker eventually spent 2 days interviewing James and his parents separately. He examined the family records, he reviewed information about Hudson and the Natoma Bay, and in 2016 he published the case in a peer-reviewed medical journal. And skeptics have gone through Tucker's conclusions and challenged part of them. That's important because this case shouldn't be protected from criticism. If reincarnation is really what happened, the evidence should survive people trying to find another explanation. And after looking at both sides, James's case still bothers me. In a good way, because after removing the weaker claims, even after acknowledging that his parents eventually believed in reincarnation, even after acknowledging that James already loved airplanes, we're still left with a very young child, a World War II aircraft carrier, a location, a crash, a named pilot, and details that existed before the family knew about James Hudson. And then there's the name James Leininger, James Hudson. Personally, I put that one in a coincidence column. It's weird, but coincidences happen. The part I have a much harder time putting in that column is literally everything else. How did a 2-year-old know about Natoma Bay? And how did he know about all the other details at the age of 2 years old? That's something that just doesn't sit well with me. But our next child didn't remember a war, he remembered Hollywood. Ryan Hammonds grew up in Oklahoma, and while still very young at the age of 3, he reportedly began talking about having lived in Hollywood. He described dancing, movies, big houses, travel, people he had known, and he apparently became frustrated that his mother didn't understand what he was talking about. Then one day, Ryan's mother was showing him a book containing old Hollywood photographs, and Ryan pointed toward one of the men. He apparently believed that the man he was pointing at was him. The photograph was from an old movie. One of the men was actor George Raft. The other that Ryan was pointing at was much harder to identify. Eventually, a film activist identified him as Marty Martin. Marty had worked as an extra in Hollywood before later becoming a successful talent agent. But Ryan wasn't just pointing at the photograph, he reportedly gave numerous details about the life he believed he had lived. And some were reportedly given before researchers knew who Marty Martin was. And I actually think the wrong answers are important too, because if we want to take the correct statement seriously, we also have to admit when something doesn't match. Some of the things Ryan said about Marty appeared inconsistent with the records. So this isn't a case where he supposedly got every single detail perfect, but there are details that are harder to ignore. One involved Marty's age. Ryan reportedly said he had been around 61 when he had died. Initially, Marty's death certificate appeared to say he had been 59 when he had died. But later research found that Marty's actual birth year was earlier than the date listed on that document, which means Ryan's statement was apparently much closer than researchers first believed. Could Ryan have somehow observed information about old Hollywood? Possibly. Could his mother's interest in the case have shaped some of what happened? That's something we'd have to consider. But we're not talking about old Hollywood figures. Marty Martin, someone that most people didn't even know who he was. And somehow a young boy in Oklahoma ended up pointing towards an old photograph and saying essentially, that was me. And knowing almost all his details. Looking at the accounts, he had gotten 80% of the stuff that he had said was true about where Marty lived, who Marty knew, how old Marty was when he died, even some of Marty's favorite food and activities and hobbies. So, how did this 3-year-old know all of that? He may have not gotten everything right, but to have gotten 80% of his statements being correct, that's much more than any 3-year-old I could imagine being able to do. Now we're going to India, and this might be one of the strongest cases in the entire episode because of something very simple. Some of the information was written down before the family was found. Sorlanta Mishra reportedly began talking about memories of another life while she was still a very young child at the age of 3. She spoke about another family, another home, people she had remembered. So her father eventually wrote down several of these statements, and these notes were given to researcher H.N. Banjari. Banjari took the information, went to the town Mishra claimed to have remembered, and reportedly located a family matching what she had described. Then Mishra was taken there, and according to the investigation, she began recognizing people and places. People who didn't believe her eventually tried to throw her off by presenting themselves as someone else. And she supposedly wasn't fooled at all. She corrected them about who they actually were. Think about why that's important. If families had met first, you could say information had been exchanged and they told the 3-year-old Marsha what to say. But if statements really were recorded first, the family was located using those statements, and the child was brought to them, that changes the situation. It doesn't automatically make reincarnation the answer in this case, but it gives us something we can actually test. What did she say before? What matched afterwards? And why was Marsha's case standing out? But why it stood out was she gave the name of all the people, described how they looked, described the place at the age of 3 years old, and she had never been there before. So when they took her there and they tried to change things on her, to try to fool her and catch her, quote unquote, lying, that 3-year-old told them what was wrong and corrected them about who they actually were. That is almost mind blowing. And I think that's why this case is one of the strongest cases in this episode. Shanti Devai. Shanti Devai was born in 1926. When she was around 4 years old, she reportedly began describing life somewhere else. She spoke about a town called Mathura. She said she had a husband, a home, and a child. She reportedly described details surrounding pregnancy and the death of a woman she believed she had been. Eventually, Shanti gave enough identifying information that contact was made with a man in Mathura. His name was Kendar Chubai. He had actually been married to a woman named Laji, and Laji had died in 1925, not long before Shanti was born. Kendar eventually came to meet Shanti, but he didn't immediately tell her exactly who he was. He supposedly tried to test her, and Shanti reportedly recognized him immediately and broke down crying. She also recognized Laji's son. Eventually, the story became nationally known, and Muhammad Gandhi became interested. He appointed a 15-member committee to investigate Shantai's claims, and in November of 1935, the group traveled with Shanti to Mathura, and according to the committee's report, Shanti began recognizing people and locations. She reportedly identified one of Laji's relatives at the station. She guided them toward places associated with Laji. She recognized family members. She even commented on things that had changed since Laji's death. And inside of one of the homes, she reportedly knew details of its previous layout that had been changed years earlier. Then there's this bizarre detail. Shantai said Luigi had hidden money inside the house, and she indicated a location to prove that she knew what she was talking about. Well, they checked that location. The money wasn't there. So, wrong answer? Maybe. But according to the case account, they found an old box under the floor in the exact location that Shantai said to check. And Luigi's husband later said he had already taken the money after her death because he also knew the location. So in the end, Shantai was telling the truth. And how does a 4-year-old know that? Now, there were skeptics, and there should be. But this didn't just become a family legend told decades later. There were investigators, there were correspondents, there was a committee of 15 people, and there were attempts to verify what she was saying. So, once again, a young child, another family, another town, a person who had died, and a child convinced this wasn't the first life she had lived. Now I'm going to tell you probably the darkest story tonight. And I want to tell this one differently. First, I'll tell you the story the way it's been repeated, and then we're going to look at a problem at the story. So, the story involves an unnamed boy. He was supposedly born with a long birthmark on his head. When he became old enough to speak, he allegedly said he had lived before and that someone had taken his life with an axe. He supposedly remembered his old village, his old name, and eventually he supposedly pointed toward a man and claimed that that man had been responsible for his previous death. He allegedly led adults to where his former body had been buried, and human remains were supposedly discovered. And according to versions of the story, the person he identified eventually admitted what had happened. That would be incredible if we could verify it. When researchers later attempted to find this boy to verify his story, they couldn't locate him. E. Haraldson reportedly tried to locate the child and his family, and he was unsuccessful. A local researcher considered the story unfounded, and the physician who supposedly originally witnessed or related the case didn't mention it in his own autobiography. So, as much as I love the story, I cannot put it in the same category as James, Mishra, or Shentai Devai. There's just not enough documentation, and I don't want to go too deep into the story if there's nothing I can verify for its case, or at least give some evidence to help support it as being possibly true. While I find it really cool and it would have been a really great story, it just doesn't have the verification to go too deep into it. So right now we have a story about a story. And that isn't the same thing as evidence. And strangely, I think admitting that makes the other cases more interesting. Because if we're willing to throw out the weak cases, the question becomes, what do we do with the strong ones? So, what could explain all of these stories tonight? Before we jump straight to reincarnation, what else could explain this? Coincidence? If enough children make enough statements, eventually some details should match somebody. That's possible. But the more specific the collection of correct details become, the harder coincidence becomes for me personally. Information leakage? Maybe the child just heard something. A documentary, a family conversation, a story, and later forgot where the information came from. That's one of the strongest normal explanations. Parents shaping the story for fame? Parents can unintentionally influence children. That happens. So you need to be careful whenever most of the evidence comes from somebody remembering conversations years later. Stories change over time. Yeah, I mean, we know stories grow. One person tells another, the internet gets a hold of it, and an interesting story becomes an unbelievable one that has been rewritten and retold hundreds of times. Then, reincarnation. There's the possibility we're actually here to talk about. What if some of these children really are remembering something? Maybe not perfectly. Maybe memory from another life would be fragmented just like memories from this one. But what if consciousness doesn't simply disappear when the body dies? What if something carries over? A memory, a fear, a preference, maybe even a physical mark? What can we actually establish? Well, we can establish researchers have investigated thousands of reported previous life memory cases. Ian Stevenson published hundreds involving unusual birthmarks and birth defects. James Leininger's case has documentation that existed before James Huston was identified. Military records existed relating to Hudson, Larson, and Antama Bay. And Ryan Hammond's Mishra and Shantai Devai were real children whose claims were investigated. What can we not establish? We cannot establish that reincarnation caused these events. We cannot establish that every remembered statement was accurate. We cannot rule out normal information transfers in every case. We cannot establish that birthmarks actually carry from one life into another. And we cannot establish that the famous boy with an axe happened the way it was usually told. While it remains unknown, we do know some very young children apparently give unusual specific information about deceased people. Why do these memories appear so young and then fade? And if the strongest cases aren't reincarnation, what are they? How do these people know how they died at such a young age? So, where do I stand after looking at all of these cases tonight? I'll be honest with you, this was probably the hardest part of the show that I had to rewrite and record multiple times. Just because so much stuff goes through my head thinking about all this. Like, rather you have a religion, you believe in what you believe, and you already have your own beliefs about what happens after you die. You don't have religion, you already still have your own conclusion about what happens after you die. So when you mix in all of them and it's like trying to look at it from a neutral point of view, it can get so crazy that your mind just blows up. So when I take all of that in consideration and stand back and look at all these stories, I'll be completely clear. I strongly believe there is something real happening with some of these stories. I believe reincarnation is possible. Like, no matter the religion, no matter what you believe, I could so see something happening to where someone lives another life. Maybe their life ended before they accomplished what they needed to accomplish. Maybe their life led them to something they had to discover for their own personal soul. Like, honestly, I think some of these cases are very difficult to explain any other way. When you got a 2-year-old describing a war he never lived through, children talking about families supposedly they never met, statements written down before researchers even identify the person the child appears to be remembering, and cases involving physical abnormalities researchers believe correspond with injuries from another person's life. At some point, coincidence stops feeling enough of an answer to me. Now, could parents influence some stories? Oh, absolutely. That could definitely happen. Could children overhear information? Of course. Could some cases be exaggerated or completely false? We've already seen tonight that they can be. But for me, that doesn't explain all of them. The reason why these stories tonight stand out isn't simply because a child said, I lived before. It's because there were things people could investigate, like names, places, families, events, documents, military records, details apparently recorded before some of those connections were even discovered. And that's the part I keep coming back to. How does a little kid know these things? Like, how do they know things that no 3-year old, 4-year old, even 2-year old should even be talking about? And then you go into the part of dreams. That's a whole nother episode that I'll definitely be doing one day. But it's like they say that when you go to sleep, that's the closest you come to dying because your body completely shuts down. And we've all, even you out there watching, all of us have had dreams that we felt was so real that we could feel the wind on us. We could feel like we could physically touch someone. Like, how does that happen? How can that just be in your head? So, yes, if you're asking me whether I believe that sometimes some part of us survives death and somehow begins again, I do. I personally do. I can't prove it, and I wouldn't tell you that science has proven it, but based on cases we looked at, I personally think that there's enough here to take that possibility very seriously because it seems like we have more things to prove it does exist than it doesn't. But I also completely understand if you don't believe it. I get that 100% because what we're talking about is an extraordinary idea. If reincarnation is real, then it changes almost everything we think about and we think we understand about consciousness, death, and what it means to be alive. So being skeptical isn't unreasonable. You should question these stories and you should look for normal explanations. And you shouldn't believe something just because it's mysterious or because some guy on YouTube told you to believe it. So, after hearing these cases, do you think reincarnation's real? Which case convinced you the most? Or if you don't believe these children were remembering past lives, what do you really think was happening? Let me know by messaging me and think about these stories because I tell you, some of them really makes you think. But before we end tonight, I want to leave you with a question. A question that I read that made me really think. And I want you to think about this whether you believe in reincarnation or you don't. Have you ever met somebody and instantly clicked with them? Like there was no awkward stage, no real explanation why you two instantly became friends. You just felt comfortable around them almost immediately without barely talking to them. Like somehow you already knew them. Or have you met someone you felt an unusually deep connection to? Someone that you cared about in a way almost immediately and it didn't make sense. But for whatever reason, you were just connected to them. Rather you liked them because of the physical looks, or you just had some weird feeling like this person I could end up talking to and could see myself with forever, and you literally had just met them. But you also knew it just wasn't meant to work out in this lifetime. What if there's a reason for all that? What if the person you instantly became friends with was your best friend once before? Or what if it was your brother or sister in another lifetime? What if the person you can't quite explain your strong connection to was someone you loved in another lifetime? Maybe that was your husband. Maybe that was your wife. Maybe somebody you spent an entire lifetime with. And somehow, out of billions of people, you managed to find each other again. Only this time, your lives were different. The timing was wrong, circumstances changed, and neither of you remember what you used to be with each other. But maybe some part of you did. And if reincarnation is real, maybe some of the people who feel strangely familiar to us aren't strangers at all. Maybe we're finding the same souls that we once crossed paths with again. And maybe all of us live lives together over and over again. And maybe that's why some people can walk into your life for the very first time and somehow feel like they've always been there. Maybe we don't remember the places. Maybe we don't remember the names. We don't remember the faces. But maybe we remember the feeling. And if that's true, then maybe somewhere inside of you, there are people your mind has completely forgotten, but your soul never did. Thank you for joining me on tonight's episode of The X-Files. And remember, question everything because the truth is still out there.